Okay, so today we're going to have a workshop around the mindfulness personality type, or as some of the early Buddhist psychologists described it, as temperament. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this, we'll go into it quite a bit more in detail today. So the outline of today's workshop, we're going to try to keep this relatively brief. I think we've scheduled close to an hour. We'll see what we can do to keep the didactic components, the teaching components, to just 15 to 20 minutes so we can really dive in, roll up our sleeves, and have a workshop around this. So I'll present some of the work for about 15 to 20 minutes on the personality types, what their background is, how they come to light, and how we can use them. And then we'll try to reserve 25 to 30 minutes for a discussion where we can interact and answer questions as well. So what I'd like to do is just to orient all of us and start with an example. So we can all kind of go through this thought experiment together. And imagine walking into a family, like a relative's house or a friend's house. And we walk in the front door and we look around. Now, based on our previous conditioning, we might see different things than what other people might see. So if we walk into the living room, for example, we might see furniture and we might see a carpet and we might see tables, for example. So depending on what our makeup is, I might walk in and start to notice, oh, wow, that's a beautiful colored couch, or that painting on the wall is really pleasing to me. Somebody else of a different kind of mindfulness personality type might walk in the room and say, oh, there's a spot on the carpet. I wonder what they spilled on there. Or, that arrangement of furniture isn't quite right. I would have done it this way. And somebody of a third personality type might actually walk in and kind of go with the flow and not really notice that they're drawn toward certain elements or drawn toward kind of a judgment of other elements. So this is really the basis for these personality types. And really the basis comes from how our brains are set up to learn. In modern day, we think of these behaviors as approach, avoid, or even fight, flight, and freeze. So, if we're confronted with a stimulus, we might be prone to kind of put up our dukes and fight it, or we might be prone to run away, or we might be prone to freeze. So we all have these three basic tendencies, but for whatever reason, we tend to have a tendency to inhabit one personality type over another. And that's what we'll dive into today, is kind of understanding this a bit more, and then also seeing how we can tap into our understanding of our own genetic makeup and our own conditioning to see how we can optimize our learning from it and see how we can best be. So I think the place to start here is with where we learned about this personality type questionnaire. There was actually a 5th century document, and as you can see, the size of this thing is called The Path of Purification. It's a commentary on the early Buddhist teachings, the Pali Canon, and this was translated from Pali into various languages. And a section of this actually describes a certain temperament that folks have. So I'm just going to, and the basis for this was that, people wanted to learn how to meditate, and they would go to a monastery at the time, and they would ask them, the monks and the nuns, to teach them how to meditate. Now, the monks and nuns wouldn't just say, okay, I'm going to teach you how to meditate. They would first have the people stay at the monastery for up to several weeks so they could observe their behavior. And based on their behavior, they could then determine a recipe for the best type of meditation practice that they could offer. Now, to my knowledge, this is one of the earliest descriptions of what we think of in modern day as personalized medicine. So think of meditation as medicine, where they were starting to personalize or link up somebody's behavioral tendency or their personality type with a certain prescription of a different type of meditation that they would offer them. And the idea behind this was that they could help them be able to optimize what their genetic makeup was and what their conditioning was to help them learn. And I'll even read a section, a few lines from this, because it's very interesting how they describe these processes. And just pardon the archaic language, but this is a literal translation from the Pali. So they say in one of the sections, what is the source of these temperaments? And herein, as some say, the first three kinds of temperament to begin with have their source in previous habit. And they also went on to say they have their source in elements and humors, because those were that was the understanding of the physiology of the day. But I just want to reiterate this. The first three kinds of temperament to begin with have their source in previous habit. So what do we mean by this? For those of you that have read my book, The Craving Mind, the general principle here is what we think of as operant conditioning, so positive and negative reinforcement. And the base, just as a reminder, I'm sure we're all familiar with this at this point, pleasant things happen, and we want those pleasant things to continue, so we behave accordingly to keep those pleasant things going, and then we lay down memories that say, oh, do that again. In modern day, we describe this through the lens of operant conditioning and subjective bias. So we start to see the world with certain lenses. So if we have a tendency toward the pleasant and trying to hold on to the pleasant, then we wear certain glasses. If we have a tendency to be, to judge or push away the unpleasant, then we move toward the negative reinforcement loop. But both of these very much contribute to us wearing the subjective bias glasses. Now, this was very interesting to us for several reasons. One, because the modern day science was lining up so nicely with these early Buddhist canonical teachings, but also more importantly, because this personalized medicine that they were describing was something that we could actually tap into as a way to see if we could help personalize mindfulness practices so that people can utilize them to the best of their ability. So the first thing that we did was to develop a modern day version of this temperament type. It's a little bit challenging to take one of these books and just hand it to people and say, what temperament are you? So we developed what's called this behavioral tendencies questionnaire. And we took these descriptions from this path of purification. In particular, we took the tendencies that they looked for. So as they were observing people in their behavior, they looked for specific qualities of action. And I'll just read from this. They said, how do we know that a person is of a certain temperament? This is explained as follows: by the posture, by the action, by eating, seeing, and so on, by the kind of states occurring. So they're talking about mental states. May the temperament be recognized. So they were not only looking at what we think of in modern day as personality types, so having people take a personality quiz, but they also relied on people's actions, not only in how they behaved, but even how they walked, the types of clothes that they wore, how they kept their living dwellings, etc. So for example, they said by action, in the actions of sweeping, one of certain temperament type grasps the broom a certain way and sweeps cleanly and evenly. So they're describing the faithful personality type, without hurrying or scattering the sand. They also described how people wore their robes. They described how they would eat. For example, they said, one of greedy temperament likes eating rich, sweet foods. When eating, he makes a round lump, not too big, and eats unhurriedly, savoring the various tastes. In contrast to this, the other personality types, for example, the aversive personality type tended to like sour food and eat hurriedly without savoring the food. So with all of these in mind, we sought to see if we could develop a personality quiz that was validated, that could be used in modern day. I will spare you all of the scientific details of this, but we collected data from about 900 people to check the validity of the items, and then we published a paper on this in a journal called PLOS One, the Public Library of Online, PLOS1, Online Science, which is supported by the National Institutes of Health and makes all of these journal articles free and available to anyone. So you all are welcome to go to the Center for Mindfulness's website and download it or search for it directly on the PLOS1 website. It was published back in 2015. So I'd just like to transition there to the results of the surveys that many of you filled out. So we had about 215 responses, and we asked folks to just describe what their predominant personality type was. So we have a discerning personality type, we have a faithful personality type, and we have the speculative personality type, just to put these in 3 broad categories. Now, based on your survey results, about 39% of you self-identified as discerning, about 37% self-identified as faithful, and about 22% self-identified as speculative. Now, this is very interesting because we had a hypothesis going into when we developed this questionnaire that the speculative types, because they're easygoing, actually can have trouble discerning what personality type they are. So we would expect that there would be a lower number of folks that self-identify as the speculative type, and that's exactly what we see from your responses, and it's also, I think, what we see in the larger study. This is interesting because what we would expect if folks were able to really clearly characterize their types, that we would see a relatively even split amongst the all 3 of them. And I'll just ask new folks that are joining the seminar at any time just to make sure you mute yourself as we go through. So I'll just read through these personality temperaments, the descriptions. You might be familiar with them, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So for the faithful greedy type, the short description is you tend to be optimistic, affectionate, and might even be popular. You're composed and quick thinking in everyday tasks. You're more likely to be attracted to sensual pleasure. You put faith into what you believe, and your passionate nature makes you popular with other people. You have a confident posture, and at times you might even become greedy for success. Crave pleasant experiences, good company, rich foods, and can even become proud. So we saw some of that in the early description where they're talking about the different types of food that the greedy or faithful type is prone toward. Your desire for superficial things sometimes leave you discontent, and as it's worse, may even lead you to manipulate others. This is in contrast to the discerning/aversive personality type. You tend to be clear thinking and discerning. Your intellect allows you to see things logically and identify flaws in things. You're quick to understand concepts and tend to keep things organized and tidy whilst getting things done quickly. Pay attention to detail. You might notice a strong dislike for certain people, places, or things. On a bad day, you may even come across as grumpy or perfectionistic. And the speculative/deluded type, you tend to be easygoing and tolerant. You think about, you're able to reflect on the future and speculate on what might happen. You think about things deeply and philosophically, as I mentioned. You might even have a posture that's uneven and variable. At times, you might easily get caught up in your own thoughts or fantasies. As you daydream, sometimes you might even become doubtful or worried about things. Lost in thought, you find yourself going along with what others suggest, perhaps even easily persuaded. At your worst, you're disorganized, restless, and absent-minded. So from the personality questionnaires that you all filled out on the Center for Mindfulness's website, and then signing up for this web-based seminar, about 55% of you report actually about about 2/3 of you reported that these types described you either at 4 or a 5 out of 5. So very, very well to extremely well. And then about the other third, another 22% reported that it was okay. And then about 10% reported that it, a 1 or a 2 didn't describe you that much at all. So the first thing we can do is kind of drop back in and ask ourselves, well, does this describe me, and how can I use this information? So I'll just give an example from today. I was actually doing a radio interview, and I walked into the studio, and let's see if you can figure out what my predominant personality type is. So I walked into the studio, and I immediately noticed the carpet was a certain color, and I noticed that the walls were being redone and that they hadn't actually painted them. So there was some spackle on the walls, and it was kind of not tidy looking. I looked around the corner, and there was this black something on the wall, and I was wondering, what the heck is this? So as you can guess, my predominant personality type is the aversive, is this discerning / aversive type. So my first inclination was to walk into that room and start judging. Oh, there's that. Oh, I don't like that, or that's a certain way, or this or that. And for me, what can be very helpful, and this is what we can really explore over the next few minutes, is how can I take that information and use it in a skillful way? So how does this help us take off our subjective bias glasses? How can I see that I am actually walking into a room and starting to immediately judge whatever is happening? For example, the faithful types might help us, when we can see that we're a faithful type, we can see where we might err in the direction of holding on to things or being overly faithful. Whereas the discerning types like myself might see where we're overly judgmental and be able to step back from that. Whereas the speculative types might learn to become more aware of how much time we spend in the imaginarium where we're thinking up new ideas, when at times it might be called upon us to have something concrete done at work or with the family. So being able to notice the type of subjective bias glasses that we're wearing is very important so that we can start to take them off. But the other side of this is that it's not just about seeing this as something that's negative or bad or something that we need to fix. These are our personality tendencies. And if we can become more aware of them, we might even be able to capitalize on them to improve our lives. So I'll just give an analogy of this. Let's imagine so the Olympics were last summer. Let's think of a sprinter versus a long distance runner. Now, if I don't really know what my propensity is, if I'm better at sprinting or I'm better at long distance running, it might be really helpful for me to try these out so that I can see, oh yeah, I'm much better at sprinting or I'm much better at long distance running. So for example, I ran track and cross country in high school, and I found that in fact I wasn't a very good sprinter. So it was not helpful for me to try to become a sprinter, and it wasn't helpful for my team for me to take a spot to try to become a sprinter when other folks were much better at that. So it's not that being a long distance runner was bad. It's just that that's what my genetic makeup helps, leads me in that direction more than being a sprinter. And being able to recognize that helps me be able to step back and say, okay, this is where I should focus my energy because I can be more helpful, both in terms of my life satisfaction, but also for my team than if I ended up trying to become a sprinter when in fact, no matter how much I tried, I probably wasn't going to be that good of a sprinter. So the key here is that if we can really get to know our types, we can live into these types a bit more. And instead of being frustrated when we're trying to do something that's really going against our conditioning, we can really lean into what our strengths are. So pragmatic tips here, and I'll just finish in 1 minute, and then we can really open this up to discussion. As they mentioned in the path of purification, they not only looked for the type of food that people ate, how they walked, how they made their beds, and so on, but they could also give pragmatic suggestions based on these personality types. So for example, if we think of meditation, for the faithful types, where their predisposition is to really focus on and hold on to things that are pleasing or the pleasant, there can be a tendency to focus on the beautiful and to kind of hold on to the beauty of the body, as one example. So it can be easier for folks of this type to be able to start practices such as loving kindness practice, because this is something that kind of is in the same ballpark as the pleasant. You know, loving kindness can feel very good when we're practicing it. But importantly, as soon as they're getting going with practice, there was an emphasis that was towards shifting to things that would help with the attachment to the beauty of the body in itself, such as meditating on things like the decomposition of a corpse. And there is actually a formal practice, if anybody's interested, where you can look at the 32 stages of the decomposition of a corpse, and through that really meditate on, you know, the impermanence of the body, etc. And as a faithful type, it can be very helpful to help break that attachment to really trying to hold on to that. In contrast, the discerning types, which are good at, you know, kind of discerning things, seeing things clearly, starting with things like noting practice in the Southeast, in the Burmese tradition, where they're really noting, you know, seeing, hearing, feeling, physical sensations, etc., can be a really good way to get started with practice. And also with concentration practices. But then once they get their practice going, it's important to shift to things that are more challenging, such as loving kindness practice. And for example, in my own life, I found loving kindness practice tremendously challenging at first. I thought it was really just, you know, hokey, touchy-feely, you know, hand-holding type of stuff. But in fact, once I had learned how to concentrate a bit, I could start to see how loving kindness helped me with my own attachment to judging people and really pointing out, you know, the flaws that not only others had, but flaws in myself as well. And finally, the last, the speculative type, in which the preponderance or the tendency is, it's very easy to get spaced out or kind of, you know, get lost in thought or in content. The emphasis is really that it's important to jump to very, very concrete practices, such as the body scan, that can really help us ground in our physical reality. So as we scan down or sweep down through the body, we're really noticing these raw physical sensations that let us know that we're here concretely, as compared to often our minds speculating about something. So that was a lot of information in a short period of time. What I'd like to do at this point is spend the next 20 minutes or so really diving into discussion. And the way we'll do this, because I'm the only one moderating this discussion, is that I'm going to ask folks to first, if you have a question, to post the question in the chat, and I can start with that. And then also, we have about 50 participants online. I can also answer these, or we can start to interact through video as well. So if you have a question, please go ahead and listen or describe or write it down in the chat. And if you'd like, while folks are writing down their questions in the chat, if you have a question that you want to ask just through video, you can unmute yourself and ask that as we go. And we'll try to use both of these forms unless it becomes too challenging. So why don't we start with any questions about the basic premise of these personality types before we jump into the pragmatic aspects of them. So just the theory, how they're set up, how it fits with the mind. I'm just going to scroll through. I see most folks don't have their videos on, so if you do want to ask a question, either unmute yourself and or show your video, and we can jump in there. And while folks are doing that, I see one question from Barbara. Do you think there are mixed personality types, discerning, speculative, for example? So Barbara, thank you very much for the question. That's a very important demarcation to make, is that for I would say for the majority of us, if not all of us, we're going to be a mix of these. So we can find what our predominant type is, but we're likely, and what we've seen from our research is that there tends to be one that's most predominant, one that's kind of the, second most, and then one that really doesn't show up as much as the other two. That being said, I've seen folks that have somewhat of an equal distribution across all three types as well. So absolutely, we can have a lot of different mixes of one predominant and then others that are kind of less predominant. The other aspect of that we found interesting is that, and I'll just use the example of my wife and myself, who both tend to be predominantly of the aversive or discerning types. When we're together, one of us, or my wife, tends to move more into her faithful, greedy counterpart at times, so that when I'm being overly judgmental, she kind of brings in this this other type that balances it out. So I think also when we're in relation to others, these different aspects that we hold can show themselves more than others. So thanks for the question. That was a really good one. Now I'll just go down the list. Sanjeev asked the questions, how do these relate to addiction? So it's a really good question. And I'm going to use addiction in a broad sense here, because I like to think of addiction along a spectrum of learning. And this learning spectrum starts with operant conditioning, and on the far end, continued use despite adverse consequences. That's one of the formal definitions of addiction. So we can look to see where our predominant tendencies are, so that when we are if we're addicted to a certain substance or a behavior, we can start to see what our tendency is, so that we can tap into that to be most helpful in working with our addictions. I'm just trying to think of a concrete example. So for myself, I'm just trying to think of a specific example of an addiction. So I'm going to come back to that, because I can't think of anything specific, and I don't want to just throw something out there. But the idea is, if we think of addictions along a spectrum of learning, we can use and utilize our personalities as a way to help us with change any type of behavior. And if we understand our personality well enough, we'll be able to utilize that to change behavior more efficiently. So Sanjeev, I hope that gets at your question. And thank you all for, I see a bunch of more questions on here. From Dan, what compelled me to look at personality types as a way to advance meditation practice? That's a great question. I was really blown away first by how this description of the personality types fit so nicely with our modern day descriptions of operant conditioning. And so there was something there that just got me very interested in learning more about them. And I wanted to really understand what they were like. And the more I dove into that, the more I could see how, how they were not only using this as a way to help describe somebody's personality, but then we're specifically using this as, as I mentioned at the beginning, a personalizing meditation practice. So they kind of had a formula for how to support people's practice back in the 5th century, which is, still much more advanced than what we have in modern day, where we're still trying to sift through large data sets and figure out, what's the best way to support somebody's practice. So with this, we really looked to this commentary to see, is there something that we can learn from this, and can we use this as a way in modern day to even support practice as well? And we're collecting a bunch of data now, both at the Center for Mindfulness and in other studies, to be able to look to see how we can predict practice and also personalize practice as well. So for me, it was really, what are the pragmatic tools that are already described that can help us really hone and make these practices most available and most useful for folks. So thanks for the question. The next question, I think it's from KWalsh37. Can you have an innate type that gets camouflaged by family upbringing? That's a great question. And I really have no idea. My guess would be, I can give some BS, some baseless speculation. My guess would be that we're going to certainly have genetic predispositions that are going to influence our innate type, and then that's going to be either fostered or potentially, like you're talking about, camouflaged or overshadowed by family upbringing. So if we have a parent of a certain type, we're certainly going to learn from them a certain number of behaviors that we kind of get from learning and their modeling for us. So I would guess the two interact in that sense, and that we probably can have these that are camouflaged by family upbringing. But again, we haven't done specific research on that, so I would have to look into that more to be certain, but that would be my guess. Next question's from Sue Wright. Did the sages who unpacked these personality types believe that these were fixed and never changed? That's a really good question. It's not described, even though this text is pretty lengthy. The section on the temperaments or the personality types is not that long. It's a small section relative to the rest of the book. They didn't go into the details in terms of whether this was something that was fixed or changeable. In modern day, there are arguments whether our personalities are fixed or whether they're changeable as well, whether these are traits or whether these traits can actually be changed. And what I would say, based on what we've observed clinically, is that these and I'll even speak from my own experience, I'm just checking in, there seems to be this predisposition that is pretty solidly ingrained that becomes less prominent when we can become more and more mindful as we take these subjective bias glasses off more and more. And as we take them off, our predisposition for any one particular type becomes less pronounced because we are not walking in a room constantly judging or this or that, caught up in our, in our old habit loops. So in this sense, I would say all of these can kind of fade or be less prominent as we become more mindful. But in a sense, there's probably something that's genetically locked in that's going to predispose us to be in certain ways, no matter what our what we learn, and that's also something that's helpful for us to know. So I don't know if the sages thought that these were fixed and never changed. What I would speculate is that there's some level of fixity in the sense of our genes, expressing certain ways that will give us, more of a predisposition over one thing over another. This question's from Lisa. Excited by the idea of tailoring practices to individuals and tendencies. Curious to know more about when people are in pain. For example, older folks with physical pain use the defense of staying in the mind or resist the calm and stillness of mindfulness practices. Yeah, this is if I understand your question, Lisa, and I may ask you to jump on this in person with me to make sure that I understand. When people are in pain, do they use the defense of staying in the mind to resist the calm and stillness? So I'm trying to relate this specifically to the tendencies in terms of staying in the mind, because my sense would be, well, let's see. So with a greedy or faithful type, we might be have a predisposition to kind of distract ourselves and think about things that are pleasant, whereas aversive types like myself might use some other type of defense, whereas the speculative type might space off or space out. So when folks are specifically in pain, what we can do is look at our own experience to see what our tendency is to do as a psychological defense, and then compare and contrast this to when we're actually practicing mindfulness, we're in the calm and stillness of mindfulness practices, to see how those tendencies are uprooted a little bit. So it's a great question. I'll have to think more about that. Mary asked the questions. I'm a faithful, greedy type, but I'm not optimistic at all. Where does this place me then? Or is it just your example of a mixed personality? Yeah, it's just a really good question. So the faithful or greedy type, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be optimistic about things. I think it really describes a bare bones personality around, if we were given a choice, would we hold on to pleasant things or would we push away unpleasant things? This doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to naturally be, optimistic, say, about the future, which is typically how I think of optimism or thinking about things in the future. So I would have to think about that a little bit more, but I wouldn't say that optimism really is, goes perfectly with the faithful greedy type. This is something to explore more, is to see, what is it about the personality type that leads toward holding on to pleasant things versus pushing away unpleasant things, or spacing out, as the other two personality types show. So thank you for the question. So Julie asked the question, says, talk about tendencies and food addiction. Okay, I'm happy to. So obviously we're in the midst of studying our Eat Right Now program, which helps people with stress and emotional eating. So these tendencies are very interesting and very much are described in terms of eating within the path of purification, this early work. So for example, with the greedy types, and I read a little bit of it, the description is that they tend to savor their food more and eat unhurriedly, as compared to the aversive types, who tend to look for sour types of foods and eat quickly and not pay as much attention to this. So we can look at these tendencies to see, no matter what tendency we are, where we might be having an unhealthy relationship with food. So any of us can fall into the habitual eating, or eat when we're stressed, or eat when we're feeling sad. But we can also start to look at, well, what types of food do I reach for? How do I eat? If I'm an aversive type, do I tend to just shovel the food in more than if I'm a greedy type? And if I'm a greedy type, do I tend to eat more because I'm really, I want more and more and more of the pleasant food, as compared to an aversive type? So again, we can really tap into what we know about ourselves and start to get to know our own personalities very well, so that we can see how these personalities play out in our everyday actions, such as eating, and how this can also foster food addiction. So we can see, it's not just a certain personality type that's necessarily going to have food addiction over another. It's really how these different types play in with the different types of habits that we form around eating. And I'll just give a short aside. When we were developing these questionnaires for the behavioral tendencies questionnaire, we actually had a question about the different types of potato chips. And this was probably completely naive on our part, but we were looking to see, could we actually determine a personality type based on the type of potato chip or potato crisp? So for example, we hypothesized that the greedy types would like barbecue potato chips because they're sweet. The aversive types would like the salt and vinegar because they're more sour. And the speculative types wouldn't have as much of a preference as the other two. Well, it was a nice thought, but the data weren't solid enough to support this. But that was the idea behind, how we could link up food with the different types of personality types. Okay, I'll take a couple of more questions. So Lisa asks, says, yes, possibly to extend the tendencies to help them move into less defensive from being with self, use the strengths of their tendencies to being with what is. Yes, so she may have been, I'm not sure, Lisa, what the question is in that. I might just be missing that. So Lynette asks, is there a correspondence between these three types and the Myers-Briggs types? That's a great question. The short answer is we haven't studied that yet to see if there is if those line up. We have looked at I think the big 5 personality types, and there is a correspondence, for example, with, I'll have to go back and look at our data because it's been a while since we've published it, but I think there are some, there are some general correspondence with the types as we hypothesized, but I would have to look at the details before I said something that might be incorrect. And another question is there a connection with our current approaches to personality traits, Jungian, Myers-Briggs? So again, good question. I really don't know. But hopefully now that these personality questionnaires are developed and published and validated, researchers can actually take these and study them a bit more. We did our first validation study with about 900 subjects, and it tends to take a large sample size to do this, but our questionnaire is only 13 items and relatively easy to fill out. So we hope that in the future, researchers will be looking at this more carefully. Okay, and Lisa also asked about the Jungian idea of archetypes and the soul's journey. I wish I knew more about this stuff because it sounds really, really interesting, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be the person to be able to answer this. Question from Landon, what does this research say about compatibility between different types and relationships and how tensions can be worked through and compatibility enhanced? I think this is a great question. I'm not going to be able to answer this from a research perspective because we've just beginning to study this, but what I can say, and I'll speak from my own relationship, and also it was very interesting when we developed this questionnaire, we really dove into this really deeply, and to the point where our research team, there were about 5 or 6 of us that spent an entire weekend just really, translating the text and really diving into it and developing these questions. And we noticed that we started looking around at the undergraduates that were around, or the other folks that weren't necessarily involved in this huddle, and we were starting to really kind of gauge their personality types based on how we interacted with them, how they walked, how they ate, how they talked. And in that sense, it was helpful for us on a certain level to be able to kind of understand more where they came from. So just as a pragmatic example, myself as this discerning or aversive personality type, when my wife can see that that's going to be my predominant tendency, if I walk in a door or if we have a conversation about something or if we're trying to work through something, if she can understand that, and importantly, if I can understand that as well, it's very helpful for us to say, okay, these are the glasses that you're wearing right now, Judd. And if we can see that I'm wearing those glasses, it helps us to be able to make a better decision if we're trying to figure something out. Or to be able to work through something together. So in this sense, her knowing my type, me knowing her type, helps me get to know her a little bit more on a personality level, and just what the types of tendencies she tends to have, which and same for her knowing mine, so that we can really kind of know, okay, this is a default, like a habitual response that one of us might have, and certainly not take that so personally. And at the same time, be able to probe that a little bit when, in the right context, where we can say, oh, boy, it seemed like, Judd, it seemed like you judged that awfully quickly. Is that just your tendency or what's going on there? And that, in that way, my wife can be very skillful and help me see where I'm just habitually reacting to something, so that I can step back and say, oh yeah, that is my tendency. The other piece related to that is, it helps us not take these things personally, like, oh, that's just the conditioning that this person has, and in that sense, we're able to kind of love that as part of them, as compared to, oh, that's something about you that I don't like. It's like, okay, this is just how our brains were set up. So thank you for the question about compatibility. I haven't seen in terms of, if a certain type is or is not compatible with another. We haven't done the research on that, and I'm just trying to think. I don't have enough kind of anecdotal data around that, because I've seen certainly different personality types link up with other personality types quite well. So I think that's something that we can all explore on our own. And also, I'd be very curious to hear, if somebody takes the quiz and has their partner take the quiz, and let us know what you notice in terms of, the compatibility and what you learned from having knowledge about these types, and how it might help hopefully you come even closer to each other. So I'm just going to take a couple more questions, and then we'll finish up. Again, I didn't want this this seminar to last, tremendously long for you, but just to give you a nutshell of it, so we can start exploring this on our own, and then perhaps come back to together later and really unpack this once we have more data. So how has this work been received by Eastern thinkers or Buddhist masters? So this is from Barbara. If you're referring to this work being the personality questionnaire that we developed and published, we've heard back from some people saying this is interesting. We actually had a former Buddhist monk and a Pali scholar on our team translating this work with us, as well as everybody on the team was very knowledgeable and practitioners themselves. So we really tried to stay grounded not only in the practice, but the theory and the Pali scholarship when we developed it. And so far, we've only heard positive things around the development of the questionnaire. Always happy to receive constructive criticism if there are Buddhist masters out there or Eastern thinkers that think that there's something that we've missed here. But we've largely based this this paper on the Eastern thinkers themselves. So it would be very interesting to hear if there was something otherwise. Last question from Sue Wright. I'm an educator in the public schools and curious about how this relates to children and growth mindset / closed mindset. Something to think about, and I'll certainly leave it at that with something to think about, because I don't know the growth versus closed mindset well enough. I know it a tiny bit, and my sense is that knowing our personality type can help all of us move into a growth mindset as compared to a closed mindset, because we can be closed in any of these personality types, whether we're closed down in the faithful, closed down in the discerning, or closed down in the speculative. From what I understand, the closedness falls more into the habit category. And so if we're not seeing where we're stuck in our own subjective bias glasses, that's going to keep us more in a closed mindset as compared to a growth mindset. But as you put, Sue, certainly something to think about. So I hope that this seminar was helpful for you all. What I recommend is, taking this on the road in terms of, don't just see this as passive learning, but really look at, the different qualities that you can really relate to in your own lives with these personalities, and really dive into them. Get curious about, what is this like in my life? And can I learn from this to be able to capitalize on the positive qualities, and also be able to let go of some of these negative qualities simply through seeing them much more clearly and knowing ourselves. And hopefully this will help us also, through knowing ourselves, be less self-judgmental about, oh, I wish I were different than I am, and more in, more in the mindset of, okay, well, this is who I am. Let's see how I can really use this as a way to move forward, not only for myself, but improving the lives of those around me. And the other thing that, if for any of you that are in our Eat Right Now program with stress and emotional eating, it'd be very interesting to hear from you all about how these personality types line up with the practices that you're doing, and as you start to change your relationship to eating. So again, thank you all very much. I'm love to hear from you, any feedback that you have on this, and any follow-up questions that you might have as you go through learning your personality types. And I wish you all well. So thank you very much. Take care.